Okay. So first let's check the microphone. Is the microphone okay? Okay, great. All right, so I want to pick up on the theme for the day, so let me start by saying this. I grew up in Blessed Sacrament, Jackson Heights, Queens. We had a great basketball team. We won the diocesan championship, and I'm sure we would have demolished the Resi Raiders if God had only given us the chance. So now, and let me thank the committee for inviting me to come, and all of you folks. It's a great sign of hope and encouragement that we're all here. Now, a couple of housekeeping notes and then we'll get going. So first, some of the orange words are bleached out a little bit. Don't worry about that. I'll tell you what you need to know, huh? And then there's my email. So if anybody wants the slides after, because you want to use them in your own church or something, then by all means send me an email. I'll be more than happy to send them to you, huh? But if I find out like you're using my stuff and charging money, then I'm going to come back and kick your ass, you know. I'm from New York, don't forget. And there's my Twitter. If you're bored while we're going on here and you want to say, man, this guy's a loser, and tweet that, that's fine too. Okay, so why don't we start, and let's have a little bit of a survey, and hopefully in the course of the time it will be clear why I start the way I do. So let's think about the world today and the world about 10 or 15 years ago. If you think that the world today is faster paced, why don't you raise your hand? All right, keep them up. That's 98.34%, that's amazing. If you think that the world today is more complex than the world was 10 or 15 years ago, why don't you raise your hand? And if you think that in the course of making decisions about your life or your organization, you'd have to cope with more change and make more decisions, why don't you raise your hand? Okay. This seems ridiculous. It seems so obvious. We all know this. But it's important, really, because it sets the framework for everything we're going to talk about today. The military has an acronym for the world we're living in today. It's VUCA. VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And whether you're running your family, running a little organization, involved in a parish, we all have to cope with VUCA. You know, how are we going to engage young kids when media technology and social media is growing a lot? How are we going to deal with the complexities that arise from everything the diocese had to go through in the last decade, and so on and so on and so on? It's a difficult, complicated world. And it doesn't feel very nice, frankly. And therefore, there's another skill that we all have to acquire in order to do our work well, and this is it. And let me tell you where this idea came from. I once had the privilege to visit Quantico. This is where among other things, the most elite units of the Marines are selected and trained, huh? We've all seen television shows about they're waking up these guys in the middle of the night and hosing them down with water and cursing at them and everything else, huh? And at a certain point, I asked the colonel, I understand that part of the reason why you're doing this is you're trying to figure out who's resilient enough to make it in these very difficult environments you're going to send people in. But beyond that, is there any skill you're trying to give these people? And without thinking, he said this: the only thing I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get these people comfortable with the reality of being uncomfortable. In other words, I'm going to send them into battle zone. People are shooting bullets. I guess that's a very uncomfortable environment. And all your instincts is bad. You know, you run away, or you're kind of paralyzed. You can't really think or take initiative. And when he said that to me, I felt like he was giving me my metaphor for the 21st century, you know? I mean, I talk with a lot of organizations, a lot of different industries. Everybody feels this way. It's uncomfortable. It's difficult. And the same is true for us. It's not real easy. But let me also say this about our situation, that to go right to what the Archbishop just said when he spoke to us about the Holy Spirit, well, we're the ones that the Holy Spirit has put on the playing field right now. And we might wish it was a different playing field and that it was easier, and in whatever version we all want, I wish there was more priests or more nuns, or I wish it was a more Catholic world, or I wish it came easier, I wish we could do it like when I was in grammar school. None of that matters. This is the world we have right now, huh? And so this is the world that we're going to play in and lead in. And the Holy Spirit is going to help us to do that, huh? I mean, you, as one model among many, think about the day of Pentecost when all those characters were sitting up in that room dealing with their own VUCA and feeling very intimidated. And then with the Holy Spirit's inspiration, they go out. And I want you to reflect on this. Absolutely nothing changed in the external world. Nothing. It was still complicated, unfriendly, everything else. What changed was what was going on inside them. So when I talk, I use a lot of businessy kinds of ideas. But frankly, everything I'm going to say is a total waste of time. If we don't, well, it might be a total waste of time anyway. But it's certainly a total waste of time unless we first say, okay, look, I have to ask for God's Holy Spirit to come to me, to our parish, and to those who are going to help with us. So that's a really important point for us to lay down. Now, another thing that I suspect everybody would agree with me, when you get into times of complexity, a lot of change, leadership is really important. You know, if like the world is totally stable and any moron can see where we're going to be in 3 years, leadership is not so hard because all we have to do is just point the car, say, oh, this is where we go. I could see very clearly. But when you are in times like we have now, when it's confusing, nobody really knows what we should be doing, then leadership is really important. So now let's think about leadership a little bit. And I want to start by inviting us to do a little survey. There was a public relations firm in the US that did a survey of folks about a decade ago, and they asked Americans whether they had a great deal of confidence in the leadership of certain sectors of society. Okay? So how about if we replicate that survey right now by show of hands? If you have a great deal of confidence in our political leaders, why don't you raise your hand? Well, my microphone broken. Can you hear me? All right. You have a great deal of confidence in our business leaders, why don't you raise your hand? Okay, look at that. We're up to a whopping 4%. You have a great deal of confidence in our education leaders, why don't you raise your hand? All right, we're probably up to 20%, 15% maybe. And you have a great deal of confidence in our religious leaders, why don't you raise your hand? Look at all those hands. That's what we call politically correct. I don't think the Archbishop is still here, you know, and we'll ask the priests to leave and then we'll have a real vote, you know? Okay, my friends, you're very pessimistic out here in Twin Cities. I don't know what that's all about. I'm from New York City. We're the great optimists of the world. So let me show you what was the correct answer to the survey. And I won't need to comment. You could read the results for yourself. Okay, and look, my friends, look in the bottom right corner. This was like in 2007 when the world was relatively still like okay. So we can imagine if this survey were done again today, surely all these numbers would presumably be lower. You know, it's hard to imagine when you look at those categories why anybody would feel better about any of them than they felt a decade or so ago. So we're creating a story together. We're creating a narrative. The first part of the narrative is we understand that we live in a world that's complex, it's difficult, it's fast changing. We all understand that in those kind of environments you really need good leadership to get through it. And we don't feel very good about the quality of leadership we actually have in many sectors. Fortunately, you feel differently about our church here, which is a great grace. So what would be better? What would be better? I want to invite us now for 10 seconds or so of quiet thinking, and I want you to think about two questions. First, please think of the names of 1 or 2 living people that you would consider to be leaders. And then second, think of the qualities or attributes or behaviors that you would associate with somebody you consider a good leader. A few quiet seconds. Now I'm going to invite you to have a little chat. I'm going to do this 2, 3, 4 times in the course of the time we have together. Short chat. It's not going to be like 15 minutes and then we can talk about the weather and everything else. So just I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. Why don't you turn to 1 or 2 people nearby, share the names you came up with, and share the ideas or qualities that you associate with good leadership. So why don't you do that, and then we'll hear a couple of those, and then I'll move on. Is that okay? Okay, good. So have a little chat and share your ideas with each other. Okay, friends, let's pull ourselves together. Let's when I know it's time to end the conversation. Like I heard a couple of people laughing. I say, we don't want anybody here to enjoy themselves. That's not why we're here, So now it's time to stop talking. Okay, so let's hear a name or two. Let's not worry about why. What was a name or two that came up in your little chats when you thought of leaders now? Okay, Pope Francis, great. Sorry? Matthew Kelly, okay, and one more? And Archbishop Hebda. We were going to stay here like for 4 hours until somebody said that, All right, good. Okay, so that's a good set. We're thinking kind of along religious lines. You could have also come up with business people, political. You had someone else? Okay, Jesus. Yeah. Okay. All right, fine. We want. That's a good list of names. Now, I wonder why we think of these names. So, what are some of the qualities or attributes that we all associate with good leadership? Why don't we hear a few of those? Okay. Somebody said what? Humility. Empathy. Okay, so able to empathize with the people I guess we're working with, and I think I heard humility over here, please. To be courageous, to be a team worker, to have some sense of vision or direction. This is where we need to go. Somebody back here had something? To walk the walk. In other words, it's not enough just to stand up there, but also I have to live it, please. To be inspiring, to inspire other people, yes? And to be a servant, and finally, adaptable, and yes, sir? Resilient. Okay, great. That's a great list. All right, now look, let me talk for a few minutes here with no slides. So who are leaders? Who are leaders? People thought of very interesting names. I wonder who thought of their own name. I guess nobody, next to nobody, or if you thought of your own name, probably you did not turn to the people next to you and say, me. Who's on your list? Pope Francis. Oh, interesting. Me. We're raised in a culture that teaches us to be modest people. So humility was one of the very first things people said about leadership, And a few of you, I'm sure, are in business, and you may know that the business research shows that maybe counterintuitive to what we imagine, humility actually correlates very well with effective leadership. We tend to think like leaders are only arrogant clowns, but in fact, people who are humble tend to be good leaders, So the humility is really essential. And of course, in the Gospels, Jesus talks about humility about every 30 verses, So humility, we cannot lose. But I want to suggest that when it comes to leadership, we're kind of walking around with a broken stereotype of what leadership is. And therefore, the first people, if we understand the idea of leadership correctly, even if we're humble, the first people we would think of as leaders are ourselves. And I'm going to explain why in about 40 seconds. And what do good leaders do to motivate the people around them? That was part 2 of the experiment, and people thought of wonderful ideas. I wonder who thought of this idea articulated by somebody with great leadership credentials, and he said this: you must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader. Sister's scrambling through her Bible. Jesus actually didn't say that, In fact, the person I quoted was General Eric Shinseki. A few of you may remember this guy was chief of staff of the U.S. Army, highest ranking military officer in the United States. Very tough guy, very tough profession. And the first time I heard it, that idea struck me as strange, out of place, coming from a military class that we all instinctively associate with macho, being tough. Or maybe not so out of place, because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that generals probably make better choices if they place the people they must place into difficulty. And I also suspect that soldiers perform better if they believe they're valued in a very deep way by the people who have the terrible job of sending them maybe to face their death. And by the way, a lot of times I think we tend to assume that, as religious people, as Christians, some of the values that we champion are not going to make us well suited for being effective leader, this kind of stuff. And here is the general saying that a value that would be of deep importance for us is really going to help to make us better leaders. And I want us all to walk away thinking, wow, we actually have a lot of strengths in our values and culture that are going to make us effective, huh? Now, I said that I would come around to the fact of how we might think about the fact that everybody leads, huh? And so now let me come on to that. And I would demonstrate that idea in two ways. The first way is to say thank you very much because you made the point for me. When I asked you to think of the names of leaders, we all tended to think of super famous people. But then when I said, give me the qualities of leaders, I was paying attention. We probably got up to 6, 7, 8. And every single value that people mentioned was a value that every person in this room could role model starting tomorrow. And probably does role model in many cases. We said to empathize, to be inspiring, to walk the talk, to be adaptable, to be resilient, and a few others. Every single idea. So this was your laundry list, not mine. Now here's a second way I would make my point. If we looked in a dictionary, we would see different definitions of the word leadership, of course, huh? But those definitions would always include this one. To point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. And isn't it true that everybody here is doing these words all the time, huh? In other words, we're pointing out a way implicitly. We're not literally standing there pointing, but implicitly we're pointing out a way by virtue of, I don't know what, whether we're just in our workplaces in the way we treat other people, whether we would stab people in the back or seek to help them, how we use our money, all these kinds of things. We're implicitly saying, no, this is the way that you ought to live. And of course, here again, the idea of way is also a deeply resonant one for us Christians, right? Because Jesus often talks about the way and even says, I am the way. So are we pointing out the way, but when we're pointing out the way and influencing others, we're showing leadership. A lot of people in this room are parents. Could there be any more obvious example of pointing a way and influencing others than what parents do for children in a lifetime? So by the dictionary definition, good parenting, that's good leadership. But though all of us are leading, most of us are doing so only subconsciously. In other words, we don't walk around all day saying, oh man, I'm a leader, and isn't that great? And I want to suggest that we need to think about that a little bit. We need to think about that life is giving us in every aspect of our life. But today, this morning, we're going to be talking about in our lives as Catholics here in this archdiocese. Life is giving us a leadership opportunity and responsibility. And so we got to think about what kind of leadership statement we're going to make. Now, so far, a lot of the things I have said, I could say and would say to a business people. So I also want to make sure all throughout that we think very deeply about leadership and everything I'm going to say in a very religious context. And so now let me spend a couple of minutes talking about how we might think about leadership as Catholics, as Catholic Christians. And maybe the first thing I would observe is that for us, leadership is a kind of a paradoxical idea. Because I guess if I went around the room and I asked people to describe what does it mean to be a Christian, most of us would use follower kind of language. Somebody would say, oh, I'm a follower of Jesus, that's what it means, and indeed we are. And our religious language uses words that have a follower kind of connotation. We use a word like disciple, vocation, and those words have a following kind of connotation. Voco means call. If I call you, you come to me. So you're sort of following. But our religious language also uses words like apostle and mission. And those words have exactly the opposite meaning. Missio means I send. So if I send you, you're not following anybody. You're out there going. And in fact, the Archbishop, when he gave his homily, even used this real, in a way, almost oxymoronic phrase that is integral to how we understand ourselves. He talked about being missionary disciples. The one word which has a leading kind of concept, we're sent, the other which has a following kind of concept. And I think that's how we need to understand and perceive leadership in our lives. We're both following and leading always at the same time, or else it doesn't work. The 6th chapter of Isaiah, I think, is a beautiful meditation on how we might understand this paradox of leadership. You know, every once in a great while I get asked to talk to evangelicals, you know, like those dudes will know what's in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. But I think like most of us here are Catholics, so I will tell you what's in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah's in the Bible. Do we need to start there? So that chapter, in some ways, we could almost understand as the prophet's experience of call. And I forget the exact language, but there's like a call, or early in the chapter, he hears this disembodied voice, whom shall we send? And he feels unworthy. He says, woe is me, I'm lost, I'm a man of unclean lips. And then as the chapter goes along, he feels himself touched by God's presence. In the imagery of the chapter, he's literally touched, like, oh good, I'm getting a nod here, she knows her Bible. A seraph flies down from God's throne with a charcoal and touches his lips, and then the call comes back, whom shall we send? Who will go for us? And then he feels worthy to say, here I am, send me. And I trust you all follow this dynamic of following and leading that's embedded in what I just said, huh? And that's the way it has to be for us. In other words, I said everybody needs to think of themselves as leader first, but not in a self-aggrandizing, not in a, it's about me, not it's my agenda, but rather in answer to our sense of calling as people who are baptized. Now, I know, like, okay, a lot of people are thinking, oh man, this is some spiv guy from New York City telling me about leadership and I don't quite trust it, and what's all this stuff about? So let me give you a better authority. Don't pay attention to me. Look at what this guy had to say. And this is, I'll give you the context. This is talking to people who were working in parish ministry in the Diocese of Rome. Huh? And look what he says. It's necessary to improve pastoral structures in such a way that the co-responsibility of all the members of the people of God in their entirety is gradually promoted. This demands a change of mindset, particularly concerning lay people. They must no longer be viewed as collaborators of the clergy, but truly recognized as co-responsible for the church's being in action. Okay, this is Pope Benedict. You know, look, I mean, I know a lot of people accuse Pope Francis of being sloppy with language sometimes, huh? Nobody ever accused this guy of not saying what he meant. So I presume he chose his words very intentionally. And co-responsibility is a very powerful idea. You know, we're all here responsible maybe for a family or a small business or something. And we know what responsibility means. It doesn't mean like, oh, I have a kid and I pay for the kid's school, but in terms of the kid's moral upbringing and health and so on, I outsource. That's somebody else's responsibility. It doesn't work like that. And look what the Pope is saying, that we need to have this mentality about our life as a church. In other words, it's not like I'm a customer in this parish and I just show up and, oh man, you know, that was good product. I liked it that Sunday, or no, you know, I didn't like the music, I didn't like the product that Sunday. No way. He's saying we need to feel co-responsible for the thing. And we need this kind of mentality to take deeper root if we're going to do well in this VUCA world that the Spirit is calling us to minister to. And you know something? I have some bad news. We are not yet there yet. We have a real long way to go. Let me show you some statistics. I'm going to have to read the numbers because they won't come out clearly. So this is from a survey that was done under the banner of Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, which the bishops co-sponsor. It's a Catholic sponsored ministry, and they interviewed people on a given Sunday who were in church across the country in different churches. You see, so this is not like those alienated people who are complaining who don't come to church. It's people sitting in church, and look what they say. I feel invited to and encouraged to participate in parish ministry, 47%. Clear to me how to become more involved in parish ministry, 32%. Parish leaders encourage me to explore my vocation within the parish, 26%. I'm interested in becoming more involved in the ministry of my parish, 22%. Okay, so let us pull on sackcloth and ashes and sit down and weep, because these are terrible numbers. And now I hope you see how the very first slide I started with and this slide tied together. We're in a situation that's very complex. We have lots and lots of challenges. Our challenges, in fact, are multiplying. I guess everybody would agree with that, as a church now, I'm saying. And the community that stereotypically, not correctly really, but stereotypically we've tended to consider the leadership group, our parish priests, our religious women, and so on, is declining in many parts of the world. And let me tell you something, that math will not work. In other words, multiplying challenges and declining players on the field. And so a key to our success, to answering the call of the Holy Spirit, is going to be we need to make these numbers better. And here's a piece of good news. Those first three categories, all those numbers can start getting better starting tomorrow, or starting Sunday, probably not tomorrow. I don't know, we have, I'm sure in this archdiocese there are really great parishes and maybe some that are not so great, so these percentages might not be representative of your place, but let's imagine that they are. And how easy it would be to change these first three categories, huh? We can stand up in the pulpit and say, hey, look, we need everybody to step up, and we want to make sure that everybody understands that we need your gifts, just like the Archbishop said. We need your gifts, and we're going to make room for your gifts, and we want you. And, unfortunately, what's going to happen? Not much in the beginning, huh? Because we've all gotten used to the way of doing things. So this fourth number, which is only 22%, it might take us a while to really budge that number. But that's okay. That's quite okay. We're going to do our part, and that number is going to change also. And some of you may know, in organizational theory, there's a kind of school of thought that I happen to believe in, I agree with, you may not, that's okay, that by and large, people and groups and organizations only change when they see no other alternatives. In other words, when it really gets bad. Let me show you a quote from a guy named Lou Gerstner. Some of you may remember he ran IBM and kind of resurrected IBM many years ago. Pardon the idea of resurrection, huh? But he made IBM better when it was not in good shape. And look what he said. Transformation of an enterprise begins with a sense of crisis or urgency. No institution will go through fundamental change unless it believes it's in deep trouble and needs to do something different. My background is mostly in finance. You heard from Mickey. I was in JP Morgan, And for example, let me I'll tell you the example in a minute or so. So we had this idea that if we want people to begin to behave differently, in this case, if we want all those folks in the pews, or at least to move from only 22% of them up to 50 or 60% of them, we're going to need to make the case about, look, I'm sorry, we need you to step up. And we can even share with them some of the realities that we're coping with now. I'm going to show you a slide of national statistics. The things in this archdiocese may be different, huh? But representatively, look at some of these numbers. 50% of Catholic teenagers no longer identify as Catholic a decade later. 50%. I always like to find the good news in something. There's good news in this too, huh? This is saying to us, okay, look, it's very clear where we need to devote some energy and imagination and time. We're losing half of these kids in a decade. So we know where we could spend some time. Second, only 27% of Catholics call themselves serious Catholics, lowest figure ever. How about this one? The ratio of 6 to 1 of adults who change religion, Catholicism attracts 1 convert for every 6 who leave. Imagine if you had a small business and this is what was going on, huh? I mean, that would not last very long. No, fortunately for us, most adults don't change their religion. And fortunately for us, we prayed a lot in Spanish. And God has been good to the church that Hispanic immigration has really made that statistic a little invisible to a lot of us. You know, we don't notice that this is what's been going on. And finally, 71% of Catholics who changed to other Christian churches left in part because their spiritual needs weren't being met. And boy, what are we here in our earthly dimension for as parishes if not to meet people's spiritual needs? So, you know, there's this idea that sometimes people won't change unless they feel there's a burning platform for change. In other words, a real need, a real urgency. And here's our burning platform. We have some very serious challenges, you know? And when we first call the rest of those parishioners to step up and lead, you know, at first a lot of people aren't going to get it. And they're going to say, oh man, you know, look, I look around here, it looks like we have enough ushers and we already have enough lectors, so what the heck are they talking about? And we're going to say, no, we're talking about something completely different here. We're going to need, again, the Archbishop used the idea of everybody has gifts and talents. And we're going to need everybody to step up and use whatever is their gift or talent for this multiplying array of challenges that we face. You know, and some people are going to help us figure out how in the world we're going to start engaging young adults again, and other people have a real passion for working with poor and marginalized communities, and they're going to help energize some of those ministries in our parishes. And other people are going to be very willing, because they're extroverted, to go out and call up on the phone the people who no longer come to church. So we're going to have to rewrite the playbook, in other words, and create a much bigger leadership pie so that many other people could step up and start to show leadership, huh? Now, everybody's going to say, okay, well, what are your smart ass from New York? What are your plans? What are your ideas for how we do it? And let me tell you something. You guys know the plans. I wouldn't know the first thing. I mean, there are best practices, huh? And we're going to hear about some best practices this afternoon. But in terms of what's going to work in Pax Christi Parish, or in this parish or that parish, it's the team there that really will have the best ideas about that. And there's another reason why I didn't want to start by talking about plans. Because to me, that's never the number one issue. The plan, the strategy, that's never the number one issue. Here is the number one issue. In other words, we come up with some tactics, some plans, some innovation, but we don't have the culture to really support it. And that's part of our problem right now. We need to renovate our culture as a church. Now let me explain what I do and don't mean by that, and this is important. You know, sometimes when we use a phrase like Catholic culture, maybe people are thinking about, our traditions, and the way we understand the idea of sainthood, and our liturgical traditions, and so on and so on. I'm not in any way talking about any of that. What I'm talking about rather is what we might call the human operating culture of a place. You know, like in other words, how do we make decisions? How ready and eager are we to try new things? How much time do we spend before we decide on something? How bureaucratic are we? Who gets a chance to talk and help in our planning? All those kinds of, the way we operate, the way we do things around here. So for example, when I worked at JP Morgan, for many years, companies used to want to come to do business with us. Then the world changed. They had lots of opportunities, and so we had to change our culture. We had to go out and sell to companies a little bit more and try to convince them to do business with us. So we had plans to do all that, but we didn't have the culture to do that. In other words, people were more used to sitting at their desk and waiting for the phone to ring. And the world was not like that anymore. And it took a while for the light bulb to go off and for us to understand, oh man, we have to start getting a culture that will be wind at our back, that will help us to accomplish what we want to accomplish, in this case as a church, not wind in our face. And this is the kind of leadership culture that I want to suggest would be helpful to us. Again, this is my opinion. This part I can't prove. I'll have to read the shaded parts for you. So 1, a culture where everyone leads. I spoke about that from the very beginning. In other words, a culture where each person in the parish feels a leadership opportunity, responsibility, or to put it in strictly Catholic terms, where people are willing to live out their baptismal promise, where we were incorporated into Christ's body as priest, prophet, and king, we say. Those are leadership kinds of words. And how do I work that out in my life as a layperson? Second idea, that we need a culture where we're more interested in generating solutions together, not in scapegoating other Catholics for our problems. And the Archbishop called us again when he was talking about this idea of unity amidst diversity, to be one church. Or to put it in secular terms, we need a one-team mindset. And there are some of us who like this kind of devotion and others who like that kind of devotion, and there's some of us who want to read this magazine and others who want to read that Catholic magazine. I won't tell you the names, but you know what I'm talking about, huh? And we really don't have time for that kind of stuff anymore. I mean, let me put it differently. Of course, people will do what they're drawn to. But we have greater unifying challenges that have to bring us together. No matter what Catholic magazine I like to read, I'm surely heartbroken about the fact that my teenage kids don't want to come to Mass. And I'm not happy about the fact that this neighbor who used to go to church no longer goes to church. And I don't feel great about the fact that we can't keep some of these parishes alive. So part of our culture, our new culture, is going to be where we say, yes, we have bigger aspirations that we're going to unite around. And a third aspect of our culture is we're going to hold ourselves accountable to match words to deeds. Remember, I cited some statistics so far, and that's important, I think. In other words, that we track what's going well and what's going poorly. A lot of times what happens, I would ask somebody, look, one of the things that Jesus calls us to is to minister to the poor. Is that happening well enough in your parish? And somebody will tell me, oh yeah, we have a soup kitchen. And that's a valid example, and maybe that's sufficient. But let me tell you something. The plural of anecdote is not data. And sometimes we get stuck a little bit with that kind of situation. Like, in other words, are liturgies really deeply leading the people who come to inner conversion and to following Jesus more closely? We're going to have to figure out ways of understanding if that's the case. Not just saying that, I know this person and she really likes Mass. So to hold ourselves accountable to whether our deeds and the facts are matching our words, and finally, to be highly entrepreneurial. In other words, to be willing to experiment, to try new things. When I use the word entrepreneurial, I know people tend to think of Bill Gates and business and this kind of stuff, huh? And I'm not saying let's go out and start a bunch of businesses and have a lot of money and wouldn't that be cool, Rather, I'm talking more about, the fundamental essence of being entrepreneurial is the idea of being willing to engage problems, frankly, and try to come up with new solutions, and also to bear the risk of a little bit of failure, and so on and so on. Now, I want to, we're just about at a little break, but before we take a break, I want to invite one other little conversation among you, because I've been talking for a long time now. And here's the conversation that I want to invite. I've spoken about a lot of different things, some statistics and some ideas about leadership and so on. So one thing that I want you to have a little chat about is, what was something that has struck you so far? You don't even have to agree with it, but something that struck you as worthy of prayer or discussion or thinking about. Second thing I want to invite you to think about is, something? Here's something we should start doing differently in our parish tomorrow or next week or next month or so on. Is that clear enough what I'm asking? Okay, great. So how about if I give you 3 or 4 minutes, have that little chat, we'll hear a couple of ideas, and then we can take a break. Is that okay? All right, great. And why don't we slowly pull ourselves back together? And why don't we hear 1 or 2 or 3 ideas, and then we could take a break for 15 minutes, okay? It's a big group, so raise your hand if you want to share an idea that came up in your conversation that you think your brothers and sisters would be interested in hearing. And we'll hear 1, 2, or 3 of those. I may repeat, it'll be hard for everybody to hear, so I will, if necessary, paraphrase what you say, and then we take a break. Okay, please. Why don't you stand up? Yeah. Okay, beautiful. So what was the other one? The Ladies Auxiliary? Okay, so our friend is saying, yeah, we have Knights of Columbus Ladies Auxiliary. They do great work, wonderful. But she says they also, in a way, leave other people off the hook, People feel, oh, those are the guys who are stepping up. And that's not going to work, huh? So we need them, but yeah, we need the other folks too. And that's going to require some rhetoric on our part. I don't mean rhetoric in a bad way, but I mean, we're going to have to explain to people like what leadership means, why it's important that we need them. And we're going to have to make space. Remember the Archbishop said, okay, everybody has gifts. But that also implies that we make space for people's gifts to be used, huh? And sometimes that happens, that people don't feel enough space to use their gifts. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Please.
I think we need to be unafraid to preach about the burning platform. Whether it's our faith enrichment program leaders, even on Sundays, we have to be unafraid to preach burning platform.
Okay, so to be unafraid to preach about the burning platform, which I interpret, like in other words, to tell people part of the reality of the situation we're dealing with, I happen to agree with you because my experience is that people react to that very well. I mean, people love the church and they know the things that the church has done for them, and people don't feel good when we say, oh man, I don't want like half of the kids to be drifting away. And so sometimes I think we get into a, almost patronizing thing of we have to cheerlead and make people feel good, encouraged. And of course we need those things. But I feel we also, in an adult way, to say, okay, look, this is the reality that we're all dealing with. And we're all co-responsible. That's what Pope Benedict says. So now what are we all going to do about it, huh? Not in a complaining way, never, because that's not going to help anything. Rather, in a way, just what Pope Benedict said, we're co-responsible. What can we all do? Okay, maybe one more, and then we'll take a break. Okay, thank you.
I teach discipleship.
Uh-huh.
I like the way you said it. It has to move into apostleship.
Yeah.
As we do on into mission. And we didn't that as part of discipleship. But you're right, that thing the leadership calls.
Okay, very nice. So she was struck by she says, I teach discipleship. Is it confirmation class? Okay, in kids who are being confirmed that are wearing out the Archbishop's thumb there. That's a good sign. She teaches discipleship, but she says she was struck by and liked this paradox, the linguistic paradox that I pointed out. The word mission, which has a very different etymological sense than the word disciple, huh? And she said she liked this idea, of being a way that we could help to convey even to these young people that the calling is both, and that we have to have both of these things going on. And I may be wrong, maybe I missed gospel class that day, but I don't think Jesus said, so let me talk a little about mission and apostleship, and let me talk a little about discipleship, and then just decide which of those you want to sign up for, and the other you can opt out of. Huh? So to help people to understand that. Okay, so look, we can take a 15-minute break. 15 minutes. And then we'll continue and finish along. Is that okay? Look at your watch and calculate what's 15 minutes from now. And how about if we get going? So, I want to continue. So the last thing that I spoke about a little bit was, helping us to imagine a different kind of culture that might help us, a different kind of way of doing things that might help us to better accomplish our goals in this VUCA difficult world we're living in. And one aspect of that is to be more entrepreneurial, and that tends to be a kind of a tricky idea. So I want to tell a story about being more entrepreneurial and try to extract a couple of lessons from it for the rest of us, and then invite you to have a couple of conversations and so on, okay? So first, you won't be able to see any of the details in these pictures. Don't worry about it. I'll tell you everything you need to know. So this is a photo of folks who are in St. Dominic's Parish in San Francisco. And as you know, in a lot of big cities, like young adults, none of them go to church. But like there's one church that they go to, and St. Dominic's happens to be that church in San Francisco. And of course it's San Francisco. So like the ones who do come, they're all like propeller heads, kids who work for Google and Amazon and so on, huh? And the pastor there, he would see all these kids coming in, and he kind of knew, oh man, there's all this talent coming here. They come in and go out every day. There must be something I can do. So one day after Mass, he talks to one of them, he says just that. What can I do? And so one of the kids says, have a hackathon. So he says, what the heck is a hackathon? So don't worry, just put an announcement in the bulletin, say that there's going to be pizza, and that's it, So he says, okay, fine. So, a month later, 70 kids show up. Kids, to me, kids, like people in their 20s and young 30s. So 70 of them show up, and the young person had told him, all you have to do is just give us a little problem to work on, the rest will take care of itself. And he says, okay, I'd like you to see if you could come up with something that would help the church in any way in its ministries. And that's all he says. And he gives them a half hour, an hour to think if anybody has any ideas. And then if somebody has an idea, they stand up and they explain their idea. And then all the rest of them kind of self-organize. So they're going to work on little apps, like on your smartphone. And so I describe my idea, and you four are kind of interested in working on that, so you kind of stand with me. And then for the next 8 hours, we kind of sit around there doing what propeller heads do. I don't know what they do, but working on apps. And then by the end of the day, they've come up with like a half dozen skeletal apps. And I'm going to describe a couple of them to you, but the real point I want to get to is helping us to think about the idea of being entrepreneurial. It's not so much about the apps or what these folks did, but just a general idea of culture. So you'll see, you're able to make out, I'm sure, groups of people with little placards, but you can't read any of the ideas. So let me tell you. So here on the upper left-hand corner, these were folks that created an app called Bible Moments. And what Bible Moments is, you download the app, and then you could set the frequency. Like once an hour, I want some Bible verse to be sent to me. Or once a day, or once every 10 minutes, or whatever. And, a Bible verse would be sent to me. And I think it even had a feature that, I could put in, I'm really depressed. And relevant verses would come back, having to do with that. So that's what these kids invented. Then these kids in the lower left, their app was called Basket Church. And so this is what this app was about. So I know this will be shocking to some people in this room. But like we carry around these things, these are quickly becoming obsolete. And they all know that. We all, keep sticking out baskets and feel like people have real money that they're going to put into the basket. And they understood the world isn't going to be like that. So they built this little app that, there would be a chip in the bottom of the basket, and there'd be an app in your phone. So when the guy came around and he put the basket, you could just hold out your phone and make your donation. And even when you made your donation, the phone would give like a little ooh angelic chorus, And he said, okay, look, that's a good idea, but maybe we cut out the angel stuff, Now, look, my point is not, most of our parishes here don't gather dozens of young, technologically able young adults. That's not my point. Although maybe it would be in 1 or 2 parishes, huh? My point is more generally what was going on there. That's what I want to get to, you know? And think of it this way in general terms. So this guy stood there and he says, oh man, you know, we have gifts out there, we have talent. How can we use it? That's the point. You know, that we would look out there and see a talent. Man, we have people who are good at gardening. We have people who really know finance. We have people who are really good at marketing. We are people who are very extroverted, willing to go out and call, you know, whatever it is, I don't know. So just that way of thinking, that's one thing. Here's another thing is, look, I hope you can barely make out those faces. Look at those smiling faces. You know, it's fun. And frankly, that's a cultural problem for us, not enough fun. You know, I mean, Jesus didn't talk about fun very much, but he certainly talks about joy a lot. And just, you know, the sheer, I'm sure you've all had this in your life, the sheer fun of going out and trying something and seeing, oh man, you know, this is really great and does it work? And the joy of working together in a group, you know, we're all going to try to do it together. And also, what I thought was extremely clever about it, one of our big problems, of course, is young adults. And so he had this very clever way, I don't think this was part of his thinking, but those who were doing work on behalf of the church were also in a way the subjects of the work itself. You know, you understand what I'm saying? Like the fact that it was the young adults doing it probably made them more enfranchised to the church or closer to the church and so on, which was a very neat trick. You know, maybe we could get the young people themselves to be the ones to do something and it will have some impact in their own hearts. Huh? So those are the things. Now, here's another point I want to make. You may be thinking, okay, well, would these apps work? Are they good ideas? And I want to say that's the wrong question. It's an important question ultimately, but it's the wrong question to ask first. And as a church, we tend to ask that question first. You know, in addition to the question, have we had 100 meetings and had it approved by 10,000 people? You know, because to prove, you know, we shouldn't be asking first, well, will it actually work? And to kind of prove to you why we shouldn't ask that question first, let me call upon one of the great prophets of our tradition, Wayne Gretzky. This is what he says. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And I mean, I'm being a little playful, but not totally playful. We're not taking enough shots, you know? And this spirit of, oh, you know, let's take a shot. I don't know what to do about young adults. I don't know about what to do about teenagers. I don't know exactly what to do about people who, you know, modern culture and individualism, consumerism, all this stuff has kind of alienated them to us. But, you know, let's take a few shots. And also, you know, let's be willing to become a really good network as parishes, you know? Like, let's sit down then after 2 months and say, oh man, what are you doing? And what worked well, what went poorly? Let's learn from each other. Here's another great prophet, is Samuel Beckett, you know, the Anglo-Irish writer, huh? Here's one of his sayings. I wonder if I'll remember it. Ever tried, ever failed. No matter. Try again, fail better. Which is a kind of a mantra, you know, for in the world of technology, but also could be for us too. You know, this idea of, yeah, we'll try, we'll learn, no problem. You know, if we make a mistake, we'll learn better. And we'll believe that somehow the Holy Spirit is guiding us and teaching us along the way. It's not just me. You know, yes, we have to use our skills and talents, but somehow God's Holy Spirit will be helping to guide us through to where we want to go. Now, I want to develop this same idea, transition it slightly to a more religious concept, an idea that's very big for Pope Francis right now. Part of being entrepreneurial is this spirit of, I'm willing to go and try something, do something. And this was one of his famous quotes. I'm sure a few of you at least recognize it. Huh? So this idea of, you know, if we become too self-referential, in other words, we're just talking to each other, that's not going to get it done, huh? And we have to be willing to venture out. And this is a big idea for him. You know, his first thing, you know, before the conclave, when they all give their little speeches, that was the only thing he talked about. We have to be a church that goes out of itself. And he keeps coming back to it in different ways. You know, he talks about going to the peripheries and so on. So I want to invite you to have another little conversation now. I'm going to tell you a couple of questions and then show you a few quotes from Pope Francis. And I just want you to read those quotes and kind of absorb them and then have a little chat about them, huh? And here's the, oh geez, I have to tell you a story first. So another way to capture this is with the idea of dusty shoes. And when he was Bishop of Buenos Aires, when he was Bishop Bergoglio, at a certain point he was asked to open a parish in the outskirts of where he was living, and the parish, the neighborhood was basically a shanty town. Slums, no paved roads, dirt roads, shacks. And he gets some Jesuit seminarians to help him. And they have to go to school during the week, so they're going to be doing this on Saturday, like as their ministry, their volunteer ministry. And he says, you know, well, what do you want us to do, Father? He says, oh, just walk the neighborhood. You know, just walk the neighborhood, visit the houses. Don't start with the people who go to church. They're like the last people we need to visit, you know? Visit the people who are unhappy, visit maybe people who are poor and kind of left out of everything, see if there's something we might be able to do with them. And how does Bergoglio decide which of them is doing a good job? He hangs out around the entrance in the seminary late in the afternoon as they come straggling home, and all he does, he just looks down. Who has dusty shoes? Those are the ones who are doing what we need to do. Now, that's a cute story. You know, what idea could we actually extract from it that's relevant to our daily situation? I think most of the roads are paved here in St. Paul, Minneapolis Archdiocese. You know, and I think we might get at it this way, that modern life tends to disintermediate us from the very things we're supposed to be responsible for, accountable for, and so on. In other words, I don't know what it would look like in your parish, but you know, geez, there's so many people who are in the parish that half of them we don't even know. And the way we interact with the whole world tends to be through spreadsheets, emails, meetings with just a few trusted people, and we don't have a real community with all of these other characters out there, you know? In other words, in Bergoglio language, we're not getting our feet dusty enough to be living the gospel the way we need to live the gospel. And so now, I'm going to show you a few other quotes from him. All of them in one way or another are about these concepts of reaching out, touching people, going to the peripheries. In one way or another, they all kind of revolve around this sort of idea. And as you look at the quote, I want you to be thinking what image or idea most strikes you. And in your parish, with what population or populations are we not sufficiently in touch? Not getting our feet dusty enough? Have to reach out more to? You understand the questions well enough? Okay, now we'll just go through these quotes and then have a little chat. Should I read them or just let you? Okay. Unless we train ministers capable of warming people's hearts, of walking with them in the night, of dialoguing with their hopes and disappointments, of mending their brokenness, what hope can we have for our present and future journey? We cannot become starched Christians, too polite, who speak of theology calmly over tea. We have to become courageous Christians and seek out those who need help most. Tell me, when you give alms, do you look the person in the eye? Do you touch the hand of the person you are giving them to, or do you just toss the coin at him or her? To love God and neighbor is not something abstract, but profoundly concrete. It means seeing in every person the face of the Lord to be served, to serve the Lord concretely. The thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It's useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wound, then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up. So I showed you a handful of quotes here, and I wonder what image or idea struck you. And now to apply it in your own parish, what population do you feel like, man, we're not in touch enough, we're not getting our feet dusty enough with this community? Okay? How about I give you 2 or 3 minutes, have a little chat, we'll hear a couple of ideas, and then we'll move on. So, why don't we hear the way we did last time? Why don't we hear one or two ideas if somebody wants to give a flavor for the conversation you just had, and then we'll move on. And maybe we could get different players into the game. Some people have shared, maybe folks who haven't shared yet. If 1 or 2 people want to give a flavor for what you just spoke about, and then we'll move along. Okay, way in the back, great, thank you so much. Yes. Yeah.
Population or anything that's messy, scary, uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We like to offshoot that to
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. And I bet there's a lot of people that would resonate with that, huh? And this is and remember, one of the very first ideas that came up was VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and I'm going to repeat it. Don't worry. And our sister has given us a beautiful example of, something. When people come to us with complex or ambiguous situations, it's really hard. So she mentioned, for example, the family that a kid just committed suicide, or the family of a kid who's LGBT, or whatever the situation may be that doesn't fit into the easy framework. It's a little harder for us, huh? So how are we going to figure that out, huh? So nice. That's a nice example. Anybody else want to share one, and then we'll move along? Please. Okay, so if we're losing 50% of the teenagers and young adults, we're obviously not reaching out, getting our feet dusty with them enough, right? And of course, part of the challenge for us is, it's one thing if they were all sitting there every Sunday, and we could say, okay, good, now I got them corralled, I have to figure out how to better minister to them. But I don't know what they're doing here in Twin Cities, but they're out like rafting on the Mississippi River or whatever the heck people do. So we're going to have to, so that's not going to be easy. So talk about getting feet dusty. And talk about this idea of, remember the quote I used from the Pope, the church that goes out of it if we don't go out of ourselves, we sicken from the air of stale rooms. So we're going to have to find a way out there to find all these characters. A priest friend of mine, he once said, you know something? If I don't hear crying in church, I know that we have a problem. Where's our future going to come from? And I don't mean crying like because the homily is so terrible that so this idea, which I hope you appreciate how it goes hand in hand with my idea of being entrepreneurial, right? The instinct to go out of ourselves goes along with the need to say, okay, we're going to have to figure out different ways of going about it. Okay, great. Now, let's keep going. Next kind of idea. Now we can finally talk about strategy, plans. We spent almost the whole time talking about culture because that's my bias. You may or may not agree. But my own bias is our culture is going to eat our strategy to death for lunch. So that's the first thing we need to do. Get people to think differently, behave differently, work with us differently. Then we can move on to the plan, the strategy, and so on. And that's important too, huh? And maybe we also have some weaknesses there. When I spoke about leadership, remember I used a very, very simple idea. Point out the way and influence others. And so too with strategy. I just like very simple ideas. And here's a simple definition of strategy that I like. A good strategy has ends, ways, and means. That's it. In other words, what ends, what objectives, goals do we want to achieve? What are we trying to get done? And then, what ways are we going to go about doing it? How are we going to do it? Tactics, processes, all that kind of junk. And then, of course, what means will we need to pull it off? What resources, what money? In our case, what prayers? We can never forget that. And I put this up here not because everything we do in church has to be very formal strategy. That's not really my point. But rather, that we would have a strategic way of thinking in general. And here's the point, here's what I mean. That I don't know how many things go on in each of your parishes. 1,000? Like, in other words, you may say Mass, but, in Mass there's a homily, there's music, there's the procession, there's how people are treated when they walk in, so if we kind of broke things down, there'd be like 1,000 things maybe. And what we tend to do is go right to ways. In other words, we just pick out one of those 1,000 things and say, oh, I have a way of how we improve our music. Or I have an idea of how we could make the collection better. And those things are important, but my point is, if we're thinking strategically, maybe we need to think a little bit more from the top first. Like, what are the things we really need to get done here? And maybe a very small list of things. Jesus told us to make disciples. That's a real bucket of things, and maybe there are a lot of little things that come under that. Or we have this idea that people who engage with us in parishes, there should be a process of conversion. They should come to follow Jesus more closely. So that would be a big bucket that lots and lots of other things come under. Or Jesus told us we have to pay attention to those who are hungry, who are in prison, who don't have enough to eat, and so on and so on. So my first idea when I say think strategically is let's always be sure that we're thinking of, what are the big things we want to accomplish, and then move along to, okay, how can we do it, what resources we need, and so on. And now why don't we practice a little bit? Why don't we draw on some of the ideas that have come up all during the morning to practice a little playing with strategy in a more entrepreneurial way? And what if I gave you this strategic problem, which has come up a lot this morning, not only from me, from you guys also. How are we going to become a more welcoming parish that reaches out? And you have to come up with 5 ideas. Doesn't have to be a world-changing idea, huh? A small idea is good. And how are we going to know whether we're succeeding? In other words, what will we measure to hold ourselves accountable? And it's a game. I mean, it's a really important, but what we do this morning is kind of like a game. We're just practicing. We're flexing our new culture of being more entrepreneurial, of owning, of being co-responsible for our situation, and so on. So how about if I give you 3 or 4 minutes? Why don't you have a chat about those questions, and then we'll hear a few ideas, and then we'll be in the home stretch. Okay? All right. Go ahead. Have a little chat. Fine. Okay. So why don't we hear? Who will give me 2 little ideas, and/or something you're going to measure? Just give me a couple. And as we've been doing, I'll repeat them. Let's just see what the Spirit has been inspiring in our little conversations here. And don't worry about home runs. Singles are great. Okay, please. Yeah.
Move to the middle of the pew before Mass.
Okay, fine. We're going to move to the middle of the pew before Mass. All right, great. Please. Okay, we're going to change the way that we communicate so it's eye to eye. And tell me another sentence about that. Like, for example.
Instead of just keep sending the same emails out asking for help, get face-to-face with people.
Oh, beautiful. So she's saying instead of just sending out an email or putting in the bulletin, we're going to ask for help, we're going to talk to somebody and say, I know you're good at this and we really need you, huh? And you're maybe going all the way back to remember that slide I showed where such a small percentage of people said they felt invited into ministry new and so on. We're going to take that excuse away from them because I'm going to go right up to this guy. Okay, beautiful. Please, Father?
Smile.
We're going to smile more. Okay. Good for you. All right, please.
If you're doing reading before Mass or something like that, and I like to introduce people that I think are maybe new to the parish, so if people get to know someone new.
Oh, nice.
Introduce people to other people.
Uh-huh. Okay, so if somebody comes that you've established as new, you think is new, you're going to say, meet so-and-so. She's really cool and...
I know a lot of people.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, great. All right, let's keep going, please.
Maybe be more intentional about preparing people who might be a little shy to go talk to other people. Somebody were to inquire and just work with them and kind of role play and say, here's how you might approach someone.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so people, especially if people are shy, maybe we'll give them a little help or coaching on how to reach out. Let me tell you something. For me, Irish, Catholic, ethnic queens, for me, to invite somebody to come to Mass, oh man, that would be like, I don't know what, jump off a cliff, When I say we need a new culture, this is not in my culture. But maybe even if we can tiptoe, that's okay too, maybe if I can't go all the way there, maybe I could say, we have this really interesting homeless outreach. I know you really care about that kind of thing. How about if you come with me? And we're going to kind of wheel them in there a little bit. Okay, what else, please?
I'd assume everyone in your church knows how to do ritual.
Okay, not assume everybody in your church knows how you do ritual, huh? Okay, nice. And in fact, I even have a story of a buddy of mine. Actually, I won't bother. It's too long a story. But anyway, the point was, they had a way of doing things in that church that he didn't know. He was visiting in the church, and he did something, and he was scolded. But what he was told he should be doing wasn't even in the rubric. In other words, they had their own custom, and fine for them, But then to kind of so you said it nicely, get so wrapped up in this is our particular ritual here, and somehow you should have known that. Okay, please, Father.
I would suggest also being real and living in a real world. Like somebody criticizes Christianity and saying they have beautiful ideas, beautiful ones, but they don't live them.
Yeah.
Being real people, a real Christian,
Uh-huh.
that can also make what comes in church.
Okay. And what, could you hear okay? I guess not. Yeah, he says, okay, be real Christians. And that can also create a more welcoming church. In other words, walk the talk, which was one of the very first things somebody said about leadership, huh? And there's in business things, I often use a quote from Albert Schweitzer, the humanitarian. He has this quote: "Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It's the only thing." And okay, that's not exactly true, but man, there's something very true about that, huh? The way people see us behaving is very powerful, huh? Okay, nice. And last idea, and then we're going to move on. Please. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go out to the county fair or different places and meet people. And I met I know this guy in Philadelphia, this great pastor. He lives in a very poor, insecure neighborhood, and he had an idea of going out and meeting people in the neighborhood, And so he got a couple of people with him, and they literally kind of went door to door, and they would knock on the door, to introduce themselves and so on. And nobody opened the door because they're very afraid. It's an insecure neighborhood, and so how often would we tend to react to that? Oh man, we tried. We tried that 10 years ago. It's never going to work. I give up. So they said, okay, fine, that doesn't work. No problem. Then they said, now let's sit down and talk about other ideas. We could think of something that does work. In his parish, they happen to have a school. And so they had and there are a lot of non-Catholics, non-parishioners who send their kids to the school because they really like the values and discipline and so on. And they had a very simple idea they'd never thought of. Oh, when we have the parent-teacher meetings, why don't we put a little table for the parish? Also to say, welcome if you want to learn about our parish. Simple, and they've already added 4 or 5 folks who just learned about it. Okay, great. So look, my point is, now I picked something that's easy, right? We could have picked a harder nut to crack, but at least in terms of getting a little momentum, look how entrepreneurial we could be just off the cuff in 8 minutes, and imagine if we kind of sat down and went around. So now let me kind of put it in a bigger framework, because at the end of the day, what people want to know is, gee, what can we go away and start doing? And so I repackaged some of the things I spoke about in terms of an approach. How might we go about it? And here are things that would come to my mind. First, really important, start creating a new cultural leadership. Explain to our parishioners, that we need them. Create a burning platform. And importantly, call them to lead. In the language that's going to be meaningful for them. The word lead, they may get the wrong connotation. Remember, it took us a while to understand that, so we might have to explain it. But probably we could explain it in terms of baptismal promise and what that means. And then a second step, build what I call a guiding coalition to help create momentum and lead change. And just by the way, this afternoon we're going to be hearing a lot about, they're not going to be using the language of guiding coalition, but we're going to be hearing about groups, small groups, and that's a very powerful way. Let me explain how I mean it when I say guiding coalition. A lot of times what happens in organizations, could be a church, but could be any human organization, is managers, people, bosses, they tend to worry about, how am I going to get this bottom 10% of malcontents to come along and be part of the program, Like the people in the parish who are always complaining and all this kind of thing, And remember, Jesus told us that we'll always have the poor with us, huh? Let me tell you something. You're also always going to have the malcontents with you. And when I say build a guiding coalition, what I mean is this. Don't waste all your energy thinking about, how am I going to convince these knuckleheads in the bottom of the pile who are resisting everything? Rather, think about, okay, here are today 6 of us who are willing and can drive this thing forward. Let's see if we couldn't attract another 6. Let's see if we could add another 2 or 3 or 4. Let's try to get to what I call a guiding coalition. Once you get up to like 10%, whether you're running J.P. Morgan or running a parish, 10% is like a magic number. Once you get a little bit of a critical mass, then you're going to start attracting others anyway. That crowd in the middle is going to come along. And the malcontents, we're not going to worry about them. Okay, so build a guiding coalition. Be entrepreneurial, we spoke a lot about that. Be accountable, we spoke a lot about that. Have ways of figuring out, hey, what's working, what's not working. Be strategic. Remember I shared what the idea is, and I don't necessarily mean in the sense of writing up fancy plans, but in the sense of a strategic mindset that starts out with the real important things that Jesus ultimately told us we had to do. Let's start with those really important things and then cascade from there, instead of starting at the very bottom, with 100 different discrete initiatives that might not add up. And then finally, look for easy wins. I think it's always important in a change project to make people feel like there's the possibility of a little momentum, And if you pick this really difficult problem, then it's very likely people get discouraged, because we can't see results. But part of the reason why I use the example of how could we become more welcoming and reach out is that for me, it has some easy win aspects to it. We might not attract a lot of new parishioners right away, but we could say, in terms of what we can control, in terms of our welcomingness, yeah, we've made some progress. So maybe think about easy wins to start. Don't start with the toughest nut to crack. Now, I want to share a couple of ideas. Then I'm going to invite you to have one last conversation, and then after that, I'll have a couple of closing ideas. So, a lot of what I spoke about is kind of inviting us to be more entrepreneurial, and here's what Pope Francis says that might help us to get a mentality of being more willing to take risk in what we do. We're not living in an era of change, but a change of era. Assume always the spirit of the great explorers, that on the sea we're passionate for navigation in open waters, and we're not frightened by borders and of storms. May it be a free church and open to the challenges of the present, never in defense for fear of losing something, huh? And remember again, the very first thing I spoke about was the Holy Spirit, and part of the Spirit's gifts is that, okay, we're not going to be so given into fear. just what the Pope is saying, huh? And we're going to ask God's Holy Spirit to help us with that. And here's another quote I like. I think that nothing I spoke about today is possible to pull off unless we're managed to summon a little courage, huh? And courage also came up in the list of qualities that you associate with good leaders at the beginning, remember? And when I say courage, sometimes people think, oh yeah, that means like there's a burning building and I'm going to run in and save somebody's life. And I mean courage in much simpler ways than that. And here's a quote I like that helps to encapsulate that. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. And a lot of you are parents and you know about this kind of courage. Some of you, I bet, are teachers. You know about that kind of courage. Huh? And, you know, everything I said, sometimes I use very businessy ideas, but everything I said ultimately ties to Jesus and following Jesus and what Jesus asked us to do. And, you know, even though I may sometimes use businessy or leadership ideas, I'm in no way saying, and I hope this was very clear, I'm not saying that we have to drink some 21st century cocktail of crazy ideas. What we have to do is start drinking more of the Kool-Aid of the first century apostles. You know? That, for me, is a beautiful template. You know, when you think about the world in which those guys were trying to operate, and how everything I spoke about today, the spirit in which they approached it, huh? And so I give you a quote from Paul, you know, which also comes back to this idea of courage. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. I have one last idea to share, but before that, I want to invite you to have one last conversation. Why don't we do this? Why don't you have a 2 or 3 or 4 minute conversation? You could talk about something that struck you during the whole morning, or something that you feel like you want to do different. Or also, we could use this as our time for Q&A. If there's some question you want to ask, this would be a time to do that, huh? So first, why don't you have a little chat for 2 or 3, 4 minutes, then we'll come back together for comments or Q&A, and then we'll move along to wrapping up, okay? All comments are welcome. If somebody wants to give a sense for what you were just talking about and what struck you, or some takeaway that you think your brothers and sisters would like to hear, or if somebody has a question of any kind, that's also great too. So, please feel most welcome. Please. We can't love until? Yeah. Okay. So my sister said, takeaway for them was, we can't lead until we love, and we can't. The first step in loving people is actually to know them, you know, not this vaguely theoretical, yeah, I love you, but that we actually have engaged with people. And I guess you're reacting, among other things, to the quote from that general that I shared in the beginning, huh? You must love those you lead before you can become an effective leader, huh? And in a way, I think it's also maybe echoing something that Father said, you know, when I said, how do we become more welcoming? And he just said, like walk the talk more, you know, be who we, like if the way we project to people can really draw them in. Oh, how about this? There's a bonus track. Who converted St. Augustine, St. Anselm, I think, was it? St. Ambrose. And I guess in the Confessions, St. Augustine has this powerful, to me anyway, this powerful quote that at first I knew him not as a teacher but as a friend, or something like that. Like, in other words, Ambrose, I'm correct? Okay, Father knows it too. In other words, Ambrose, the way Ambrose treated him as a person is what first drew him, not what he taught or anything like that. Okay, great. So that's a very helpful idea. Thank you. What else? Please. Okay. All right. So I took away a lot of messages, but what roles will the parish priest play? And once I read a little writing in a bulletin, and the guy said, I see us as a community of leaders and of leaders forming other leaders. So to me, that's an interesting mindset, that if the parish priest is thinking, look, part of my job is to call people into leadership and help form them into leadership, and I think there's no ambiguity about this point, but let me say it one more time. When I said we all have a leadership role to play, everybody understands that it's within our own calling and role and so on, right? I mean, by no means am I saying, oh yeah, Chris said that I have to step up and show some leadership, and in fact, there are some dogmas I'm not very happy about. I'm going to go home and write my own encyclicals, I mean, everybody understands that, there's different roles. And, geez, the parish priest is in the perfect, supreme position, to be the one who invites and calls us to show leadership in the ways that we can, and I would see that as the instrumental player in the whole machine, in making the whole machine work, and I bet that there are guys who are doing a terrific job at that right now, and there's some that will do better, a spark will go off and they'll step up. And let's be frank, the church is like any human organization. There are guys who are not doing a good job. And, even sometimes who might have some blockage of even wanting to do that. And please don't take this the wrong way. Please don't take this the wrong way. But in a minority of circumstances where that's the case, maybe we also have to understand what are going to be the guerrilla tactics we'll use to make this a place where leadership occurs, even if I have to somehow, maneuver a little bit around that guy. Now, I know that's a tiny minority of cases, but if we believe that what's at stake is really, really important now, then I feel like we have to say, we can't say, there's a little bit of a blockage or obstacle, so I tried, let me give up. I mean, sorry, that can't work anymore, Okay, so nice, provocative question. I know you meant nothing derogatory, yeah, and neither do I. Yeah. Yeah, does the message come from the altar? And I would see a lot of chances to preach about this, frankly. That it would align very beautifully with some of the messages we get, especially in this Easter season. When we're hearing all these stories from Acts, and it gives a wonderful invitation to say, hey man, look at those guys. Let's just do what those guys did. Okay, any other question, comment? Okay, please. Okay, great. So, and first of all, I'll explain the nuance of that statistic because I went by it quickly. So my sister said that one thing that was eye-opening to her was that statistic I quoted. Remember that said 71% of former Catholics left in part because their spiritual needs were not getting met. Okay? But now, first let me explain the full nuance of that statistic to make sure we're talking about the right thing. So that's a survey that Pew Research does, and they ask people, not just Catholics, but of different religious traditions who stay and leave, what their reasons are. And the first thing I want to say is the statistic I quoted is for people who went to other Christian churches. So it's not people who decided, oh, I'm an atheist or something like that. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I want to share is that the way the survey worked, you could say more than one thing. That's why I said 71% said in part. So they may also say, for example, I didn't like the teachings of the Catholic Church, and by the way, my spiritual needs weren't being met, okay? So now, having said all that nuance, let me say this. That was the highest factor of that community, that their spiritual needs weren't being met, you know? And, it wasn't, the highest factor was not, I do not like what the Pope teaches about this, that, or the other thing. There are plenty of people who have that issue, right? And maybe there's nothing we can do about that. But if people say their spiritual needs aren't being met, I mean, that should wound us terribly. And importantly, you ask the question, what can we do about it? That is exactly the question. And here's the first thing I would say. Those people are sitting out there silently suffering or becoming disengaged, and we don't know who they are. You know what I mean? So to me, the first thing we could do about it is understand, as a parish, is this a place where people are being nourished, where they feel like their spiritual needs are being met? And let's ask that question every year, not once every 10 years, but every year. And at first, maybe it won't be so nice to hear, but eventually we'll feel really good, about the fact that we're in a nice feedback loop, and if we have problems, we'll deal with them. And a few of us have made comments about getting to know people. And surely that is the most powerful way, that I'm friends with him, and I get to understand, oh man, it is not working for him, and so we have an opportunity here. So thanks for picking up on that. Okay, so that's a good and a fair question. So the question was, when people answered, my spiritual needs are not being met, what does that mean, huh? And in the Pew Research, it doesn't detail it, right? So it could mean anything it means. It could mean anything people say it means. But let's not let ourselves off the hook too early, too easily. I know that's not your intention, because I've seen other surveys where people talk about spiritual needs and so on, and they're not talking about there's good coffee and donuts after and the parking lot empties out fast. What they talk about is, I want to grow closer to Jesus and understand the Bible better, these kind of things. So in that survey, it could have meant whatever people want it to mean. But there's plenty of other research that tells us when people make comments like that, what they're referring to is things that would make us feel real bad, that it's not happening in our church. In other words, they're saying, I'm not growing up closer to Jesus. Perfect. Without that input and information, how can we possibly respond? So we have to create that loop, because I don't know many people who are going to be brave enough to stand up after Mass and say that to a pastor or somebody else. So how are we going to create that little feedback loop, informally and formally? Very nice. Okay, look, let me finish off now, and I promise I'm going to finish 5 minutes early, huh? So everybody will be happy. So the first thing is, you didn't think you were going to get out of here without any advertising, did you? So that's my email address again, if you want to have the slides or anything else. And most of what I spoke about mostly came from 3 different books, especially the book in the beginning, the book in the middle, Everyone Leads, How to Revitalize the Catholic Church, and Pope Francis, Why He Leads the Way He Leads is another one. And I have a book that just came out this week, Make Today Matter. And if you can get those in Amazon or wherever you want, and I think at least one of them maybe is on sale somewhere. Okay. So that's the end of the advertising. Now, here's my last idea. I'm going to let you read this, and then I'm going to comment on it. Okay, so look, I can see that most of you are too young. But I remember when this guy came out of jail. And let me tell you, I remember watching this guy those first months and thinking, holy cow, you know, what a package that this guy has. You know, all the natural charisma in the world and all the courage that anybody could ask for, and you name it, you know. And then many years later, I was reading an interview or something, and I saw this quote. And I felt like he was smacking me in the head, you know, as if he was saying, hey, pal, like your hypothesis is that everything in South Africa came easily to me because I was so courageous and had all this charisma. No, in fact, I was afraid. And so, Chris, now tell me what's your big excuse in life. And let me tell you something. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of very successful people in more than one industry. And by no means do I know all of their stories. But in the cases where I do know people's story, I could tell you this. Everybody's afraid. And nobody has enough self-confidence. The people who have enough self-confidence are the narcissists. And they're not the solution here, as we're rapidly discovering. You know, but for the rest of us, if we have even a modicum of self-awareness, we quickly become aware that life thrusts us into all these situations that we don't feel perfectly skilled or prepared for, you know, whether it is the day that this new baby popped into my life to, you know, now when we're all trying to figure out how to create thriving parishes in this terribly VUCA crazy world that we're living in, you know? And to me, you know, leadership does not mean that I'm going to read some book or go to some course and then all of a sudden have all of the confidence I always wished I had, and, you know, that's the day I'm going to hop on my bicycle and ride into the office and really make a big contribution, you know? It just doesn't work like that. You know, to me, leadership is more about that despite my issues and despite my fears and despite my lack of confidence and my baggage, that I also appreciate that I have some talents. Or let's put it in the language of our faith, that I have gifts. It was the first thing that the Archbishop spoke about. You know, appreciate that I have some gifts and that I have some wisdom. You know, I've learned things as a human being in the course of going through certain things. And also that I understand I feel called, right? That's a very deep notion in our tradition. So we have a calling, and I hope you appreciate that, you know, calling for us does not just mean disciple, the follower part, but also mission, the going part, the leading part, the sending part, being sent part. And therefore, you know, despite whatever issues we all carry around, that we would honor, you know, the fact that that we have been called and that we have gifts, and that God's Holy Spirit will somehow grace us to do what we might be able to do in the circumstance. And let me just end with that and thank everybody for listening and wish us all the best of luck as we try to make all our parishes and this whole archdiocese a place of really great leadership in the tradition of our church. Thank you.